The hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin as the passengers settled into their seats. The familiar sounds of a flight taking off bringing a sense of calm to the routine of air travel. For the young man sitting by the window, this was just another flight. He had boarded the plane with a slight sense of anticipation for the trip ahead, but mostly, he just wanted to get comfortable and make it through the journey. It was a busy time of year, and he was eager to reach his destination as quickly as possible. He slipped his headphones on, drowned out the noise of the busy cabin, and focused on the book in his lap. The text seemed to help him shut out the world for a while, as the stories on the page captured his attention and allowed him to relax, even if only for a few minutes. He had no idea that this routine flight would turn into something far more difficult than he could have imagined. The plane took off smoothly, climbing into the sky with a gentle incline. As it leveled off, the flight attendants began their usual rounds, checking on the passengers, offering drinks, and making sure everyone was settled in. The young man kept his gaze on the pages in front of him, but he couldn't ignore the soft murmur of voices around him. The noise in the cabin felt comfortable, like a white noise that didn't demand attention, but somehow something was off. Not long into the flight, a flight attendant, a woman in her mid-30s with a stern expression, approached his row. She walked past a few seats, scanning the passengers quickly, her eyes sharp as though she was looking for something. When she reached the young man's row, she stopped in front of him. Her voice was firm but polite as she asked, "Excuse me, sir, can I speak with you for a moment?" The young man pulled his headphones off and looked up at her, confused. "Is something wrong?" he asked, sensing a sudden tension in the air. He hadn't done anything to attract attention, nor had he noticed anything unusual about his behavior. "I need to speak with you," the flight attendant repeated, her tone a little firmer now. She wasn't smiling, and the seriousness in her voice made the young man's stomach tighten. He hadn't done anything wrong, yet here she was, acting as though he had. He looked around the cabin briefly, wondering if anyone else had noticed this strange interaction. Most of the passengers were either asleep or distracted by their own activities, but there were a few who seemed to glance in his direction. Their eyes didn't linger, but there was a certain curiosity in the way they looked at him. Okay," he said, trying to remain calm. He stood up slightly to make room for her. "What's this about?" He hadn't been told of any changes to the flight plan or any announcements, so this was completely unexpected. Without warning, the flight attendant stepped closer and lowered her voice. "We've had reports that you've been acting suspicious," she said, her words cutting through the air with an uncomfortable weight. "Several passengers have raised concerns about your behavior." The young man's eyes widened as he tried to process what she was saying. "Suspicious?" he repeated, unsure if he had heard her correctly. He looked around again, his mind racing. Who had reported him? What had he done that could possibly have led to such an accusation? "I haven't done anything," he said quickly, his voice defensive now. "I'm just sitting here reading." The flight attendant looked at him with a mixture of disbelief and sternness. "We have protocols, sir," she replied, her tone not softening. "If there's a concern raised, we have to investigate. Please come with me." The young man's heart began to race as he stood up, feeling a knot tighten in his chest. He wasn't sure what was happening, but the way the attendant was speaking, the way she was handling the situation, felt wrong. She wasn't asking if he was okay. She was treating him like a suspect, someone who had already been judged. He glanced at the white passenger sitting beside him, a middle-aged woman who had been calm and quiet throughout the flight. Her eyes flicked toward him for a brief second, and for just a moment the young man felt a tiny bit of comfort in her gaze. Maybe, he thought, she would speak up, say something to help clear things up. But the moment passed quickly, and the attendant's insistence to move him wasn't something he could ignore. With a deep breath, he followed her down the aisle, trying to ignore the feeling of all eyes on him. He could hear the low murmur of voices behind him, people whispering and exchanging glances, and he couldn't shake the sense that he was being scrutinized by everyone in the cabin. They reached the back of the plane, where the flight attendant asked him to stand in a small, open area by the galley. The young man could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. He had been accused of something he didn't understand, and the air around him felt thicker with each passing second. He was starting to panic now, wondering how this could possibly get any worse. A few moments passed. The minutes seemed to stretch on forever. The young man sat in his seat, his mind racing with questions. He had no idea why the flight attendant had singled him out, or why she was treating him as if he had done something wrong. He hadn't done anything. He hadn't even raised his voice or acted out of turn. He had simply been reading his book, trying to relax, when suddenly everything had changed. The plane hummed steadily in the air, but the noise didn't comfort him like it usually did. Instead, it felt louder, almost suffocating, as he sat there in the silence. He could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him. It was like the whole plane had become aware of him, watching with a mix of curiosity and judgment. Some passengers were pretending not to notice, their heads turned away, while others couldn't help but glance over, exchanging quiet whispers. He looked over at the flight attendants, who were now busy tending to other passengers. The one who had approached him was nowhere in sight, but the tension she had left behind hung in the air. The young man wanted to ask someone what was going on, but he didn't know who to approach. He was afraid that if he spoke out, it would make things worse. His gaze moved to the woman sitting next to him, the white passenger who had seemed so calm when he first boarded. She hadn't said anything when the flight attendant had spoken to him, but he could feel her eyes on him now. He wasn't sure if it was concern or just curiosity, but it made him uncomfortable. He didn't want anyone feeling sorry for him. He didn't want to be seen as a problem, but then something unexpected happened. The woman leaned toward him, her voice low but clear. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly, her eyes meeting his. There was no judgment in her tone, just genuine concern. The young man blinked in surprise. He had been so focused on the chaos in his own mind that he hadn't even thought that someone might actually care. He nodded, his throat tight. "I don't know what's going on," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "I haven't done anything. I don't know why she singled me out." The woman gave him a sympathetic look, but her expression quickly turned to one of confusion. "I don't understand. You've been sitting here the whole time, right? You've been quiet just like everyone else." "Exactly," he replied, his frustration starting to bubble up again. "I don't know what she's talking about. I'm not even doing anything out of the ordinary." She paused for a moment, thinking. "I can't say I've seen anything strange either," she said. "But it's strange, right? She came up to you so quickly, like she already had a problem with you." The young man let out a slow breath, his fingers tightening around the armrest. He was grateful for her words, but it didn't change what was happening. "It's like she was looking for a reason to accuse me. But I don't know what for. I'm just sitting here." The woman nodded in understanding, and for a moment they both sat in silence, the unease in the air thickening. Neither of them knew what to say next, but the tension felt unbearable. The flight attendants continued to move through the cabin, attending to other passengers. But the young man couldn't shake the feeling that he was still being watched. As the minutes passed, his anxiety grew. He tried to distract himself by looking out the window, watching the clouds below, but it didn't help. The questions in his mind kept swirling. Who had reported him? What did the flight attendant think he had done? Was it something he had said or something about the way he looked? He hated the uncertainty of it all. He hated that he was being treated like a suspect without any explanation. The flight continued on, the minutes ticking by slowly. The young man tried to keep his composure, but it was becoming harder and harder. The more he thought about it, the more upset he became. He had been accused of something without cause, and it felt like there was no way to clear his name. Finally, the flight attendant returned, her expression as serious as before. She walked past the young man's row again, but this time, her eyes lingered on him for just a second too long. He could feel the weight of her gaze as if she were sizing him up, looking for something to prove that her accusations had been right. The young man swallowed hard, but he didn't say anything. There was no point in arguing. He had already tried to explain himself, but it hadn't made a difference. The flight attendant stopped a few rows ahead and began talking to another passenger, a middle-aged man who was seated by the aisle. The young man watched them, wondering if he was the next person she was going to question. His stomach twisted at the thought. He couldn't understand what was happening. But the more he thought about it, the more it felt like he was in some kind of nightmare. After what felt like an eternity, the flight attendants made their way to the front of the plane, preparing for the in-flight meal service. The young man remained seated, trying to gather his thoughts. He had been so careful. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't done anything to cause a scene. And yet here he was, being treated like a criminal. The woman sitting next to him was still watching him, her brow furrowed in concern. She opened her mouth to say something, but before she could speak, a flight attendant came by handing out drink carts and snacks. The woman turned her attention away, allowing the flight attendant to pass. It was a small moment, but it was enough to remind the young man that they were just strangers to each other, and she didn't have to help him. No one was obligated to do anything, and yet she had. He appreciated the small act of kindness, but it didn't make him feel any less confused or scared. He wanted to leave, to get off the plane and walk away from the accusation hanging over him. But he couldn't. Not until they reached their destination, and even then, he wasn't sure what would happen. As the meal service continued, the young man couldn't stop thinking about the way the flight attendant had treated him. What had made her so certain that he was guilty of something? Had she assumed he was trouble because of the way he looked? He had no idea. But the more he thought about it, the angrier he became. The feeling of being unjustly accused, of being treated like he was less than Ev. The descent began, and the cabin filled with the sound of the plane's engines shifting as it descended through the clouds. The young man's hands were clenched tightly on the armrests, the feeling of unease still heavy in his chest. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something deeper than just the flight attendant's sudden attention. The way she had singled him out, the way the other passengers had reacted, it all felt so off. The white woman who had been sitting next to him had remained quiet for most of the flight after their brief conversation. The young man hadn't expected much more from her, but he couldn't help but notice that she seemed to be watching him more than she had before. It wasn't obvious, but there was a certain awareness in her eyes, as though she was keeping track of everything around her. She didn't seem to buy into the flight attendant's story, and that small comfort was something he clung to. He tried to steady his breath, taking in the view out the window. The clouds below were breaking apart, revealing patches of the land as they neared their destination. The familiar sights of the airport slowly came into view, but the young man wasn't sure if he felt relief or dread. The flight was almost over, but it wasn't like he could just forget what had happened. As the plane continued its descent, the flight attendant started preparing for landing, securing trays and making final checks on the cabin. The young man could hear the low murmur of passengers all around him, but it felt distant, as though he was trapped in his own world. His mind kept returning to the same questions. What did the flight attendant see in him? Why had she accused him when he hadn't done anything? Was this really about him, or was it something bigger? He had been treated like a problem without even knowing what the problem was. The woman beside him had finally closed her book, and now she was looking out the window, her posture stiff but composed. The young man glanced at her again, unsure of what to do next. He wanted to ask her if she knew what was going on, but he didn't want to draw attention to himself. Still, he couldn't help but feel that maybe she could offer some insight. Maybe she had seen something, noticed something that he had missed. Just as he was about to speak, the woman turned to him. "You're not in trouble, you know," she said quietly, her voice soft but reassuring. "I know it seems strange, but I don't think you've done anything wrong." He blinked in surprise. It wasn't often that someone spoke to him like that, especially after what had just happened. "It doesn't feel like that," he said, his voice tight. "It feels like I'm being treated like I'm guilty of something, but I don't even know what it is." The woman nodded, her expression sympathetic. "I know," she said. "But you don't deserve to be treated like this. It's not fair. You've done nothing wrong." The young man didn't know what to say. The words felt like a balm to his frayed nerves, but the reality of the situation was still too overwhelming. He felt like the whole plane was watching him, even though no one was. Every glance, every whisper, it all felt like part of the same judgment. "I just don't get it," he said quietly. "Why me? Why did she come to me out of all the people here?" The woman sighed softly, looking down at her hands for a moment. "Sometimes people see things that aren't there, or maybe they see something they don't understand, but that doesn't mean you're the one at fault." He nodded, but the feeling of being an outsider, of being unfairly targeted, was hard to shake. He had spent most of his life trying to avoid drawing attention to himself, trying to blend into the background and stay under the radar. But today, none of that seemed to matter. The spotlight had fallen on him, and there was no way to escape it. The flight attendant who had been so insistent earlier was now moving toward the front of the plane, speaking to another flight crew member. The young man watched her for a moment, her body language still tense, her steps purposeful. He couldn't understand why she seemed so sure of herself. He hadn't done anything wrong. And yet, She had treated him as though he were guilty of some crime. As the plane began to level out, the flight attendants started to make their way down the aisles again, preparing for the final approach. The young man could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he braced himself for the landing. He wanted this flight to end, but at the same time, he didn't want to face whatever awaited him once they touched down. The woman next to him turned again, catching his eye. "You'll be okay," she said, offering a small smile. "This is just a misunderstanding. Don't let it get to you." But even her reassurance couldn't settle the storm in his mind. The more he thought about it, the more confused and frustrated he became. Why had the flight attendant singled him out? Was it something he had done? Or was it simply because of who he was? His mind kept returning to the idea that his appearance might have played a role in the way he was being treated. But he didn't want to think about that. He didn't want to believe that something as simple as his skin color could make people see him as a threat. As the plane touched down and the wheels hit the tarmac with a soft jolt, the young man's thoughts were interrupted. He felt a brief sense of relief, but it was quickly replaced by the anxiety of what would come next. The plane slowly taxied toward the gate, and he could hear the sounds of people unbuckling their seatbelts, getting ready to disembark. But he wasn't ready. He wasn't ready for the uncertainty that awaited him outside the plane. The cabin lights dimmed as the seatbelt sign came on, signaling that they were preparing to exit the plane. The young man stood up, gathering his things, and glanced over at the woman beside him. She was already standing, gathering her belongings with a calm efficiency. For a moment their eyes met, and the young man offered a small, uncertain smile. She nodded in return, a silent gesture of solidarity. The young man couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed, even though the flight was finally over. He had gone from a simple passenger on a routine flight to someone who had been accused of something. The young man stepped off the plane, his legs still feeling a little unsteady as he walked through the jet bridge and into the terminal. The noise of the airport was overwhelming, a chaotic blend of voices, rolling suitcases, and overhead announcements. But beneath the noise, there was a persistent hum in his mind, a weight that he couldn't shake off. The events of the flight had left him feeling uneasy, and even though he had made it to his destination, the uncertainty lingered. He moved through the terminal, following the signs to baggage claim. His thoughts were still scattered, and his chest tightened every time he thought about what had happened on the plane. Why had the flight attendant treated him the way she had? Was it truly a misunderstanding, or had something else been at play? His mind kept replaying the events, trying to make sense of the situation. But the answers weren't coming easily. As he neared the baggage claim area, he saw a crowd gathered around the conveyor belts, everyone anxiously waiting for their luggage. He could feel his anxiety rising again. It was as if he couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. He tried to shake it off, reminding himself that he was just another person in the crowd. But it was hard to let go of the tension that had built up over the course of the flight. He found a spot near the conveyor belt, keeping a safe distance from the other passengers. He didn't want to get too close, didn't want to attract any more attention to himself. He didn't need that right now. He just wanted to get his bag, get out of the airport, and find somewhere to be alone for a while. It wasn't long before his bag appeared on the belt, and he quickly grabbed it, his fingers brushing against the worn leather handle. He lifted it with a sigh of relief, glad that the first part of his journey was over. But as he turned to leave, he noticed the woman who had sat next to him on the flight standing a few feet away, scanning the area for her luggage. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and she gave him a small, reassuring smile. It was a quiet gesture, but to him it felt like a lifeline. She had been the only person who had shown him kindness during the flight, the only one who had acknowledged the injustice of the situation. He nodded in her direction, and she walked over to him. "You made it," she said softly. Her voice warmed despite the bustle of the airport around them. "You okay?" He nodded, but his smile was more of a nervous gesture than anything else. "I'm just trying to get through the day," he said quietly. "It's been a lot," she smiled understandingly. "I get it. It's not easy when things don't make sense, when you feel like you're the one being targeted for no reason." He exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of her words sink in. It had been such a strange experience, and it wasn't over yet. He still didn't know what was going to happen when he left the airport, or if he would ever get an explanation for what had happened on the plane. The uncertainty of it all made it hard to breathe. "Are you going to be okay?" she asked, her voice gentle. "I mean, do you have somewhere to go?" Or do you want to talk about what happened? The young man shook his head. I don't even know where to start, he said, his voice shaking a little. I keep thinking about what she said, what happened on the plane. And I don't know why it happened. I didn't do anything wrong, and it just feels like it's all out of my control. She nodded again, her gaze thoughtful. I understand. It's like everything happened so fast and you didn't have the chance to explain yourself. But don't let it consume you. The world might not always make sense, but that doesn't mean you have to carry it all by yourself. Her words were comforting, but they didn't completely erase the knot of anxiety in his chest. He still felt the sting of being wrongly accused, of being treated like someone who didn't belong. It wasn't just the flight attendant's actions. It was everything that had led up to that moment. The way people looked at him, the way they had assumed something about him without knowing him at all. It was the weight of all those small moments, the little judgments that added up over time. I just don't get it, he said, his voice low. Why did she do that? Why did she single me out? I haven't done anything to make anyone suspicious. And I feel like no one even cares about that. It's like I'm invisible but also guilty at the same time. The woman looked at him with a mixture of sadness and empathy. Sometimes people act based on their own fears or biases, she said. And when they're in a position of power like a flight attendant or anyone else who's in charge, they can make snap judgments that affect others. It's not right, but it happens. And it's not fair. Her words hit him harder than he expected. He had thought about the situation in a lot of different ways, but he hadn't considered the possibility that it was something as simple and yet as complicated as fear. The flight attendant's actions hadn't been about him personally. They had been about something bigger, about assumptions, about stereotypes, about the way people saw him before they even knew him. Maybe she was afraid of something, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Maybe she saw me and thought I was trouble, but I wasn't. I didn't do anything. The woman placed a gentle hand on his arm. You didn't. And you shouldn't have to justify your presence to anyone. You're allowed to be where. The young man walked out of the airport, his mind still racing as he made his way to the taxi stand. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the city as he stepped into the cab. He was exhausted, physically and emotionally. But there was a strange sense of peace that had settled over him since his conversation with the woman at the baggage claim. He didn't know where he was going or what he would do next, but for the first time since the flight, he felt like he had a little control over his life. As the taxi moved through the busy streets, the city outside felt like a distant world. It was strange to think about how everything had changed in such a short time. What had started as a routine flight had turned into something much bigger. Something that challenged him in ways he hadn't expected. The feeling of being wrongly accused, of being treated as if he didn't belong, had been overwhelming. But in the end, it was the small acts of kindness that had helped him through it. The woman on the plane had been a stranger, but she had offered him something that no one else had. A listening ear, a kind word. It had made all the difference. He didn't feel completely at ease yet, but her support had helped him see that he wasn't alone. That there were still people out there who cared enough to stand up for what was right. It was easy to feel like the world was against you when you were caught in the middle of something unjust, but sometimes, all it took was one person to remind you that there was still goodness in the world. The cab driver's voice pulled him from his thoughts. Where to, kid? The driver asked, glancing at him through the rearview mirror. The young man hesitated for a moment, unsure of where to go. He didn't have any plans, and he didn't know the city well enough to make a decision. But something about the driver's easygoing attitude made him feel comfortable, as if he didn't need to have everything figured out. Just take me somewhere quiet, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Somewhere I can think. The driver nodded without question, turning the wheel to head toward the outskirts of the city. The ride was peaceful, the hum of the car's engine and the soft murmur of the radio the only sounds breaking the silence. The young man leaned back in his seat, his thoughts drifting once more. He thought about the flight, about the way the flight attendant had treated him, about the way everyone had seemed to treat him like he was the problem. He thought about how the woman had stood up for him even when no one else had. It wasn't just about the injustice. It was about how people reacted when they saw someone being mistreated. Some stayed silent, some didn't notice, but others were willing to speak up, to make things right, and that gave him hope. After a few minutes, the taxi pulled off the main road and into a quieter neighborhood. The driver slowed down, scanning the area for a good place to stop. "This area's peaceful," the driver said. "A lot of parks around here. You can get some fresh air and think things over." The young man nodded, feeling grateful for the suggestion. He had been cooped up in a small airplane seat for too long, and he was desperate for some space to clear his mind. The driver pulled over to the side of the street and parked the car. "Take your time," the driver said with a friendly smile. "I'll wait here for you." The young man stepped out of the cab, inhaling the cool air as he looked around. The neighborhood was quiet, with tree-lined streets and small houses tucked behind fences. It felt like a world away from the chaos of the airport and the flight. He walked down the sidewalk for a few blocks, his hands stuffed into his pockets, his mind still processing everything that had happened. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Maybe just some peace, or maybe some answers. But for the first time since the flight, he felt like he could breathe. He reached a small park at the end of the block, a quiet green space with benches and a fountain. The sound of water trickling from the fountain was soothing, and he found a bench near the edge of the park where he could sit and watch the world go by. The sun had almost set completely, leaving a soft twilight glow over everything. The park was peaceful, and for the first time in hours, the young man felt a sense of calm. He sat there for a while, letting the stillness wash over him. The events of the day kept replaying in his mind, but the edges of the memories were starting to soften. The flight attendant's harsh words, the uncomfortable glances from other passengers, it was all still there, but it didn't feel as heavy as it had before. It was just part of his story now, part of the experience that had shaped this moment, and while it hadn't been fair, he was learning to accept it as something that had happened, something he couldn't change. The young man looked up at the stars, now twinkling faintly in the darkening sky. He thought about how easy it was to feel lost in the noise of the world, how easy it was to get caught up in the expectations of others, to feel like you had to fit into a mold that didn't fit you at all. He had spent so much of his life trying to be invisible, trying to avoid attention, that when something like what happened on the plane occurred, it felt like everything he had worked for had been shattered. But now, sitting in this quiet park, he realized that it didn't have to be that way. He didn't have to hide. He didn't have to let the actions of others define him. He was allowed to take up space, to exist as he was, without fear of judgment. As he sat there, he thought about the woman on the plane again, the one who had stood up for him, who had seen something in him when no one else had. Her kindness had been a turning point, a reminder that even in the darkest moments there was always the possibility of light. It had made him realize that he wasn't alone, that there were people who would speak up, who would stand by you when the world felt like it was against you. He thought about how small acts of kindness could make a world of difference, how they could change everything. The sound of footsteps on the path brought him back to the present, and he looked up to see a man walking toward him. It was the taxi driver who had gotten out of the car and walked over to the park. He gave the young man a friendly wave and smiled. "Just wanted to make sure you were doing." "All right," the driver said, his voice warm. The young man smiled back, feeling a strange sense of comfort in the driver's kindness. "I'm okay," he said. "Just needed some time to think." The young man returned to the taxi, feeling a sense of calm settle over him as he climbed back into the car. The city lights twinkled outside the windows, casting a soft glow on the streets as they drove away from the park. He leaned back in the seat, his mind clearer than it had been all day. The anxiety, the confusion, the sense of being unfairly accused, it was still there, but it didn't feel quite so overwhelming now. Maybe it was the quiet time in the park, or maybe it was the kindness he had encountered from the taxi driver. But whatever it was, it helped him see things in a new light. The taxi driver, who had been so friendly earlier, seemed to sense the change in the young man's mood. He glanced at him in the rearview mirror, giving him a small smile. "Feeling better?" he asked, his tone casual but kind. The young man nodded. "Yeah, I think so. I just needed some time to clear my head." The driver nodded, keeping his eyes on the road. "Sometimes the world throws some strange things at us, but as long as we keep moving forward, we'll get through it." It was simple advice, but it was exactly what the young man needed to hear. He felt a strange sense of gratitude for the driver's words. It wasn't often that a stranger cared enough to speak with such wisdom, but in that moment it felt like exactly what he needed to hear. Life didn't always make sense, and sometimes it felt like things were happening that were completely out of his control. But that didn't mean he couldn't still keep moving forward. The taxi wound its way through the city streets, and as they reached the edge of town, the young man realized he was getting closer to where he had been staying. It was a small apartment, nothing special, but it was his space, and for the first time today, it felt like a safe place. He had been away for a few days, and even though he hadn't really wanted to come back to the city, something about it felt grounding. Maybe it was just the familiarity of it all, or maybe it was the need for a place where he could finally let his guard down. When the taxi pulled up in front of his building, he hesitated before getting out. "How much do I owe you?" he asked, reaching for his wallet. The driver waved him off. "It's on me. Just take care of yourself, all right? And don't let anything hold you back." The young man smiled, feeling a surge of appreciation. "Thank you," he said. "Really?" The driver gave him a small wave as the young man stepped out of the car and onto the sidewalk. The cool air hit him as he stood there for a moment, just taking it all in. The evening felt different now, calmer, quieter. He wasn't sure how he had gone from feeling so lost and frustrated to feeling like he was in control again, but he was grateful for it. He walked into the building and took the elevator up to his apartment. His mind still processing everything that had happened, it felt strange to think about how much the day had changed him. What had started as just another flight had turned into a lesson in resilience, in the importance of standing up for what was right, and in the power of small acts of kindness. The flight attendant's actions, though unfair, had forced him to confront his own feelings of helplessness, but the support of a stranger had helped him see that he didn't have to face everything alone. As he entered his apartment, he kicked off his shoes and made his way to the couch. Flopping down and letting out a deep breath, the weight of the day felt like it was finally lifting off of him. He didn't have all the answers, and he probably never would, but that was okay. He didn't need to know everything right now. What mattered was that he had made it through, and that he had found a way to move forward. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling him from his thoughts. He picked it up and saw a message from the woman who had sat next to him on the plane. She had been quiet since they parted ways, but now she had reached out. He hesitated for a moment before opening the message. "I hope you're doing okay," the message read. "I know that things didn't go the way they should have, but I just wanted to say that I believe you. People can be quick to judge, but that doesn't mean they're always right." The young man smiled softly as he read her words. It was a simple message, but it meant so much. It was easy to feel like no one understood, like he was the only one who saw how unfairly he had been treated. But in that moment he realized that wasn't true. There were people who cared, people who saw things for what they were, people who weren't afraid to stand up for what was right. He quickly typed a response. "Thank you for everything. It really means a lot that you spoke up for me. I don't know what would have happened without you there." He hit send, feeling a sense of relief. It was a small exchange, but it felt important. It reminded him that even in the most difficult moments, there were people out there who would stand by you, who would help you see that you weren't alone. The evening wore on, and as the young man sat on the couch, scrolling through his phone and trying to distract himself from the events of the day, he found himself thinking back to the taxi driver's words. "Keep moving forward." It was such a simple thing to say, but it had struck a chord with him. Sometimes that was all you could do in life. Just keep moving forward, even when things didn't make sense, even when the world seemed to be against you. The key was to not let those moments define you, to not let them hold you back. It was easy to feel trapped by the things that happened to you, to feel like you were always at the mercy of other people's actions. But the truth was, you had more control than you thought. You could choose how to respond, how to let things affect you. And as long as you kept moving forward, you could always find your way back to peace. As the night stretched on and the city outside grew quieter, the young man felt a sense of resolve settle over him. Tomorrow was a new day, and no matter what happened, he was ready to face it. He didn't have all the answers, and he didn't need to. What mattered was that he had made it through the storm, and now he was stronger for it. He had learned that he didn't have to let anyone define him, that his worth wasn't determined by the judgments of others. And with that thought, he finally allowed himself to relax, settling into the comfort of his apartment, ready to face whatever came next with a newfound strength. The driver nodded, taking a seat on the bench beside him. They sat in silence for a few moments, watching the stars, the sounds of the night filling the space between them. It wasn't a conversation about anything important, but for the young man, it felt like the first moment of true peace he had experienced in hours. Sometimes, life throws things at you that you can't control, the driver said after a while. But it's how you respond that matters. Don't let other people's actions drag you down. The young man nodded, appreciating the words more than he had expected. He was starting to feel like he could move on from the flight, like he could let go of the weight that had been holding him down. It wasn't about forgetting what had happened, but about choosing to let it go, to not let it define him. "Thanks," he said quietly. "I needed to hear that." The driver smiled again, standing up and stretching his legs. "Any time, kid. You take care of yourself, all right?" The young man stood as well, offering a genuine smile. "I will. Thanks for everything." As the driver made his way back to the cab, the young man stayed behind for a few more minutes, watching the stars above. He felt lighter than he had all day. There were still a lot of questions he didn't have answers to, but for now he had peace. And that was enough. When he finally turned and made his way back to the taxi, he was ready to face whatever came next. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He was stronger than he had been before. And that was all that mattered. You are, just like anyone else. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words settling in his chest. It wasn't easy to accept, but it was the truth. He hadn't done anything wrong. And in the end, he couldn't change the way the world sometimes saw him, but he could control how he reacted to it. He could choose not to let the actions of one person define him. "Thanks," he said, his voice stronger now, though still tinged with emotion. "I appreciate you talking to me. I know it's not easy to get involved, especially when something like this happens, but it means a lot to me." She smiled at him, her eyes kind. "You're welcome. I know it's not easy, but you're not alone in this. You don't have to carry it all by yourself." He nodded, feeling a sense of relief that he hadn't expected. For the first time since the incident, he didn't feel entirely alone. The kindness of a stranger, the small gesture of support, had made all the difference. As the airport crowd bustled around them, the young man realized that, no matter what had happened on the flight, he still had control over how he moved forward. He couldn't change the past, but he could choose how to handle the future. And with that thought, he felt a small spark of hope begin to grow. The woman waved goodbye as she moved toward the exit, leaving him standing by the baggage claim. He stood there for a few moments, lost in thought, before turning toward the door himself. There was still a long road ahead, and he didn't know what it would bring. But for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt ready to face it. And if no one could tell him exactly what that something was, it felt like he was standing at the edge of something bigger, something he couldn't control. As the passengers began to file out of the plane, he hesitated. The woman had already moved ahead of him, but she paused near the door. The young man wasn't sure if she was waiting for him, or if she just didn't want to leave without making sure he was okay. When she saw him still standing there, she turned and walked back toward him. "You don't have to face this alone," she said softly. "If you need someone to vouch for you, I'll be here." Her words surprised him, and for a moment he felt a surge of gratitude. It was a small thing, but it meant more than he could put into words. He nodded, his throat tight. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I really appreciate it." And then, with a final look at the woman who had shown him kindness, the young man walked off the plane and into the airport, unsure of what would happen next, but determined to face whatever it was head-on. Everyone else was overwhelming. Finally, as the meal service wound down, the flight attendant returned to check on him. This time she wasn't as harsh, but the tension in her eyes was still there. She asked if he needed anything, but the young man couldn't bring himself to respond. He simply nodded, trying to keep his emotions in check. She walked away again, but her presence lingered in the back of his mind. It was clear now that the situation wasn't going to resolve itself easily. He was stuck in a place where nothing made sense, where his only crime seemed to be existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. But what could he do? What could anyone do in a situation like this? The minutes passed slowly, each one feeling like a small eternity. The young man glanced over at the woman seated beside him, wondering if she would say anything more. But she didn't. Instead, she sat there quietly, her eyes on her own book, seemingly lost in her thoughts. It wasn't until much later, as the plane began its descent toward the airport, that the young man started to feel the weight of what had happened. He hadn't done anything wrong, yet he had been treated as though he had. The injustice of it all was becoming clearer, and he couldn't help but wonder what would happen once the plane landed. and the flight attendant remained standing nearby, her arms folded. There was no offer of an explanation, no attempt to help him understand why this was happening. She just stood there silently waiting. He tried to steady his breath, focusing on his racing heart, telling himself that there must be some sort of misunderstanding. "Can you explain what's going on?" he finally asked, his voice tight. "I haven't done anything wrong." The attendant's response was cool, almost dismissive. "Like I said, we've had reports. It's not up to you to question the process. You'll just have to wait for further instructions." Her words only deepened his confusion and growing frustration. The tension in his chest continued to build, and as he looked around, he noticed that the passengers on the plane were starting to pay more attention. Some were pretending to mind their own business, but others were openly watching, curious or perhaps concerned. The young man felt exposed, his personal space shrinking with each passing moment. The white passenger, the woman who had been sitting next to him, was still watching, but now she had stood up, her brow furrowed in what looked like disbelief. She seemed torn between remaining silent and stepping in. The young man's mind raced again. Could she say something to help? Could she explain that he wasn't doing anything out of the ordinary? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the attendant spoke again. "You're free to sit down for now," she said, her tone slightly softer than before. "But I will be checking with the captain, and you'll need to stay here until we determine how to proceed." The young man nodded, still in shock. He returned to his seat, feeling like all eyes were on him. As he sat down, the white passenger caught his gaze again, this time with a look that seemed to say, "I'll be watching this." She didn't say anything, but the brief moment of silent understanding helped him regain a small sliver of composure. The rest of the flight would pass with an uncomfortable quietness, but the young man couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was happening. His mind raced as the minutes ticked by, wondering how this would unfold and if he would ever understand why he was being treated this way. The story was just beginning.